Well, thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar, Save Your Brain, Do the Dozen Today for a Healthy Brain Tomorrow. I'm Greg Berry, Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Just a quick disclaimer, since we're coming to you in a virtual format, please excuse technical issues or other things that may seem out of place. Additionally, the webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website tomorrow. If you have questions throughout the presentation tonight, go ahead and toss them in the chat. We'll have time for a Q&A after tonight's presentation. A healthy brain is critical for living a longer and fuller life. Once dementia-related cognitive decline begins, there's little that can be done to reverse it. Tonight, we're exploring how modifying behaviors and habits can impact our brains with Dr. Ronald Lazar. Dr. Lazar is a UAB professor and Evelyn F. McKnight Endowed Chair for Learning and Memory in Aging. He is also director of UAB's McKnight Brain Institute and director of UAB's Division of Neuropsychology. At this time, I would like to actually welcome Dr. Lazar to the program and turn things over to him. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Dr. Lazar.
Thank you, Greg, for inviting me. Can I confess something to you all? It is the feelings of helplessness of healthcare providers when we have to look patients directly into the eye and tell them that their condition affecting their minds has no treatment with established clinical benefits. As a neuropsychologist, one of the reasons I came to UAB in 2017, after many years at Columbia in New York, was that my thinking was beginning to change about cognitive decline and dementia, going from diagnosis to prevention. What I would like to do tonight is share this journey with you from the past 5 years, which has brought me from hopelessness to hopefulness, and where this impacts you. Let us cut to the chase. We are missing an extraordinary opportunity to save our brains. The fact is that 80% of strokes are preventable, and 40% of the dementia cases are preventable as well. And the relationship between strokes and dementia will be apparent in a couple of slides. So people ask me all the time, what is the difference between, say, dementia and Alzheimer's disease? Well, dementia is any condition that causes cognitive decline over a period of time, not days or weeks, but rather months and years. The most common forms of dementia include Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, and frontotemporal dementia. Alzheimer's disease, however, is the most prevalent form of dementia. So then people ask, well, what is cognition? Cognition is not one thing. It's a collection of mental skills controlled by the brain. It includes memory, language, thinking, decision-making, attention and concentration, processing speed, perception, and personality changes. In the case of Alzheimer's disease, memory is the hallmark skill that is typically affected. So this is a series of charts telling us about the burden of neurologic disorders across the United States from 1990 to 2017, the Global Burden of Disease Study. And what we have is 4 graphs which show us those neurologic diseases which cause the most disability in the United States. Under panel A is stroke. Stroke is the #1 cause of disability in the US. In panel C, the third most common cause of disability in the United States is Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And as I will convince you, this is no coincidence. What's even more striking, perhaps, if you look at the same global burden of disease, is that the prevalence of stroke and Alzheimer's disease are highest in the Southeast US. If we look at Alabama specifically, Alabama has the highest stroke disability burden in the United States and the 3rd highest Alzheimer's disease and dementia burden in the United States. So this is a public health problem that is especially prevalent where we live. So what links stroke and dementia? Well, if we think about vascular risk factors, high blood pressure, diabetes, elevated cholesterol, and heart disease, all of these factors lead to the occurrence of stroke. But it also turns out that the same risk factors if you add them cumulatively, increase the prevalence of dementia, as you see in the graph on the left. The lowest burden of dementia is when there's only one burdened, one vascular factor, and there's a higher burden when you get to 4 and 5 factors. So why is this new urgency? Why are we repacking things? We know about hypertension. We know about diabetes. Why are we thinking about this in new ways? Well, the current US population is about 332 million today. The fact of the matter is, despite all of the promotion by the American Heart Association, the National Institutes of Health, AARP, and other institutions and organizations, there are still 160 million people in the United States who have high blood pressure. 32 million have diabetes. Nearly half of the United States is obese, and it's up 12% in the last 20 years. 53 million people continue to smoke, and 50% of the United States population does not meet physical activities guidelines for us to achieve optimal health. So the fact of the matter is, with all this knowledge, we still haven't achieved our ability to attack these risk factors. So last year, I had the opportunity to chair a committee for the American Heart Association, where we put out a scientific statement for putting primary care into the agenda for healthcare clinics for brain health. The reason why is this: because intervention doesn't begin when you're 65. It's a lifelong process. Well, how do we know this? Well, the Cardia study, for example, enrolled Black and white adults between the ages of 18 and 30 years of age. And they found that variability in your blood glucose levels below the threshold for diabetes 25 years later was associated with worse memory, processing speed, language fluency in midlife. The Insight 46 study, which was done in England, enrolled people born in 1946, and they found that higher diastolic blood pressure and change in diastolic blood pressure in the period of time between ages 36 and 43 years of age was associated with smaller brain volumes and more abnormalities with the brain itself at 70 years of age. The ARIC study, the atherosclerotic risk and community study, enrolled Black and white adults between the ages of 40 and 65 years of age. And they showed that midlife hypertension, diabetes, poor dietary patterns were associated with increased risk of later life dementia. So intervention begins in our young adult years. And the reason why it belongs to primary care, because it is the place where we get lifelong treatment as a part of our well-being, from often from pediatrics, but generally from adulthood all the way through older age. And it seemed like the ideal environment in which to initiate it. So the reality is that although primary care is the place to have this, the conversation about risk factors in dementia is not taking place. In a study published in JAMA Neurology 3 years ago, 1,000 respondents between the ages of 50 and 64 years of age found that about 5% ever reported having a discussion about dementia prevention. Afro-American Blacks perceived their risk as lower rather than 2 to 3 times higher, as the studies show. While managing risk factors could reduce dementia risk, few discussions on this matter are taking place, and respondents were engaging in strategies that were not evidence-based at all. So my goal today is I want you to be a partner in maintaining your brain health, to work with your primary care people and be able to maintain your brain health as long as possible. These are things that you can do starting today. So I am going to describe to you 12 targets, things that are accomplishable, doable, within the spectrum of our everyday lives, and we're going to go through each one at a time. Let's talk about blood pressure control. The current target for blood pressure is 120 over 80, systolic over diastolic, based on the results from the SPRINT trial, which was published in the New England Journal in 2018. To make the point, if your systolic blood pressure is above 160, you have a 25% increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. if your systolic blood pressure is above 140 millimeters of mercury, you have an 18% risk for Alzheimer's disease. And the Framingham Offspring study from Massachusetts showed that if your blood pressure is equal to or greater of 140/90, you're nearly twice as likely to develop incident dementia. So we must bring our blood pressure down. And there are a variety of ways to do it, including medication, exercise, and so forth, but it is a very important goal. The next target is physical activity. The current target, based on the American Heart Association, is 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise, often spread out over several days, or 75 minutes per week of high intensity exercise. People ask me, is walking good for you? Well, of course walking is good for you, but it's good for your muscles and your joints, but it doesn't benefit the brain. You have to engage in at least moderate intensity exercise, and this is throughout the age span. Well, how do we know this? In a study that was published about a decade ago, they looked at the benefits of physical exercise training on cognition and quality of life. And in this case, it was frail older adults. And what I want to show you here is that the blue bars represent those who were put in exercise training, and the red were controls who were just given information about doing exercise. And each bar represents a different domain of cognition. So this is working memory, this is memory for facts, this is your speed of processing, decision making, as well as verbal reasoning. And in every single case, if you engaged in exercise training, your cognition was better. So physical exercise is really important. You've got to keep your glucose low. The current target for fasting individuals is below 90 milligrams per deciliter for free blood glucose and 5.7% for hemoglobin A1C, since there are different ways of measuring it. So if your blood glucose is too high, you're at risk for prediabetes, diabetes, and diabetes causes inflammation in the brain. It leads to both vascular dementia as well as Alzheimer's disease. So we have to keep our glucose levels low. We have to keep our cholesterol level low. The two kinds of cholesterol that we're going to describe here are HDL, or high-density lipoproteins, or LDL, low-density lipoproteins. The HDL is the good cholesterol, and we try to keep this above a value of 60 milligrams per deciliter. The bad cholesterol is the LDL, and it's not shown well here, but these are supposed to be blood vessels. Didn't come out in the graphic, but the fact is, when you have a high HDL level, you build up plaque in your blood vessels. The clogging out there reduces blood flow to the brain, and therefore is a high risk for cognitive problems. We don't use a weight per se as a measure of obesity. It's actually the relationship between your height and your weight, which is called the body mass index. And what we have here is 5 dimensions for people who are underweight, a normal weight, which is between 18.5 and 24.9 BMI. And then you have people who are simply overweight, obesity, and extreme obesity. And this sort of gives you a sense of what the body mass looks like. As I showed you earlier, 42% of the United States actually falls in these two categories. We have to bring this down because the higher the BMI, the greater risk you have for cognitive decline. You need to monitor your diet. And I know this has been the topic of other webinars that you've seen in the past, but I want to make the general point. Better foods include fruits and vegetables, dairy products, lean protein, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and extra virgin olive oil. Less good for you are red meat, processed meat, fried fast food, sweetened pastries, butter, and refined processed or hydrogenated oils. Now, it's not to say that we never have red meat. The question is moderation and balancing your diet. The fact is, the better foods you have, the lower your risk you have for developing dementia. The more of these foods you have, the greater risk you have. So the choice is yours. So yes, there are times when you have red meat and you have it in moderation. But the fact is, if you balance your diet, and I know there will be more webinars about this, the less likely you're going to affect your brain and you're going to maximize your brain health. A delicate subject is reduction of alcohol. Drinking in moderation is critical. For men, the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism say that men should have equal to or less than 2 drinks per day, and women equal to or less than 1 drink per day, for no more than 3 times a week. Red wine is typically better than white wine, but you need to understand that alcohol is the most widely used depressant that we take as a drug in our body. Alcohol is a drug, and the brain does not like that. So it doesn't mean that drinking in moderation is necessarily going to hurt you, but it puts you at greater risk the more you drink. Let me bring this home in some example here. These are brain images. The brain on the left is from a moderate drinker, and the brain on the right is from an alcoholic drinker. These are both 57-year-old men. So this is an MRI scan. So in an MRI is a brain image that involves radio waves and magnetism. And a computer reconstructs the image that is obtained so that you can look at slices from top to bottom, left to right, and from front to back. These particular slices of the brain, about 5 millimeters thick, are from a slice from top to bottom. This is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain, this is the right side, and this is the left side. And this is a fairly normal looking brain for a 57-year-old. This is the brain of someone who's an alcoholic. Look at all the brain mass that's missing. This is a problem. And what is also true is that you don't have to be an alcoholic to lose brain mass. The more alcohol you have, the more likely you're going to lose brain tissue. There's no question about it. Most people who are moderate drinkers are at less risk, but the fact is when you go over to more drinks than we've just described from the National Institutes of Health, you run a risk for losing brain. Now, it's often asked, well, what happens if you stop drinking or you lower your drinking? Does that improve your brain? And the answer is yes. The brain has the remarkable ability to regain some of its mass. So if you stop drinking at the level you are today and drink less, tissue will reemerge, especially the supportive tissue around neurons. Smoking and vaping cessation, absolutely critical. And the simple matter is you don't do it. Smoking is bad for the brain, vaping is bad for the brain. Cigarettes have about 4,700 different ingredients in there, including tar and as well as the well-known nicotine. Vaping has fewer of these extraneous products by a higher concentration of nicotine, and the brain does not like nicotine. And it causes slowing of mental function, it causes personality changes. There is no reason to smoke. And if you're smoking today, you need to stop to save your brain. People underestimate the importance of sleep. The optimal amount of sleep is about 7 to 8 hours per night. When you don't get enough sleep, the following happens. These are data from the Whitehall study, which was performed in England, of about 8,000 individuals who were about 50 years of age. And along the bottom here, you have an objective measure of sleep duration. And along the left side here, you have the hazard for developing dementia. And you can see here, the lowest hazard is about 7 hours. The longer you sleep, in fact, the worse likely that your brains can be protected. So too much sleep is not good. But even more dramatically, less sleep is even worse. And what this dashed line means that there is variability, that there are a number of people who actually have even a higher risk for dementia when they get smaller amounts of sleep. So 7 to 8 hours is optimal. Taking sleep medication helps sleep, but it's not a natural sleep. So if you have problems sleeping, it could be from obstructive sleep apnea, which needs to be corrected, and you should see a sleep clinic for that. Or if there's anxiety or stress and so forth, you need to seek help to find better ways to sleep. And most people who undergo that kind of process sleep better, and even melatonin is known to help as well. The brain likes social engagement and interaction. People often ask, well, if I'm at home and I do Sudoku and crossword puzzles, is that good for the brain? Well, it's certainly not bad for the brain, but it's not best for the brain. The thing to do is to get out, talk to people, whether it's in your church or your synagogue or the library. It is mixing it up with people. That's what the brain wants. The brain wants active interaction with people. Active, not passive. So yes, you can do Sudoku and crossword puzzles, but it doesn't benefit the brain as such. A big cause of cognitive decline is stress. Now, stress, of course, can happen for many different reasons. It could be from problems at work, problems at home, stress in the community that you live in. There are many different sources of stress. What makes stress bad for the brain is that stress causes inflammation. And inflammation can go across the blood-brain barrier and actually infiltrate the brain and reduce its efficiency to work. And to give you a dramatic example of what inflammation does, it's now widely believed that when people have the long COVID syndrome, it's not the virus that gets in the brain, it's the inflammation that develops in the body, and that gets into the brain. So at the extreme, inflammation can be very bad. But in any way that you can reduce your own stress, it could be through therapy, it could be modifying your environment in some way, working on something in your job, the less likely you're going to have impaired brain health. Finally, you need to maximize your hearing and your vision. The data are now clear that people who have uncorrected hearing or uncorrected vision, when it's possible to make it better, are more likely to develop cognitive decline. Not only because of sensory deprivation, but also leads to depression. And when you have depression, you're less likely to take care of yourself. And then those other risk factors we talked before are more likely to happen. So what we decided to do here in Birmingham is to take these principles, which appeared in our scientific statement last year, and actually put these meat on some bones. And so what we've begun to do is integrate into clinical practice and primary care settings a brain health advocacy mission. So we're in the middle of phase 1 now, where we have a clinic within a clinic. And we are now working with 2 UAB family medicine clinics, both at Hoover and Highlands. And in this pilot project, 1 afternoon session per week in each clinic, run by Dr. Pamela Bowen, who's a nurse practitioner, we administer a brain care score. We can see how you're doing with respect to these targets we've just talked about. We can get your cholesterol, and we can calculate your BMI, and we can take a look at your blood pressure and look at your glucose, as well as your lifestyle habits, and we can get a score. Then what we allow patients to do is to choose their own initial targets. We let you decide which ones you want to do first. And we want you to start in small steps that are achievable and gradually increase the rigor in which we do these things. And our hope is by doing 1 or 2 of these, you'll begin to do others. Enrollment is ongoing, and we're extremely pleased that we're able to do this. Our program director is Jessica Bowen, who I will talk about more in a minute. So, what kind of takeaways do we have from all this? Cardiovascular risk factors and lifestyle management benefit the brain. Studies show that these factors are treatable, every single one of them. Treatment appears to lead to primary prevention of cognitive decline and dementia, and attention to these factors is a lifelong process. So the thing to do is to start early and to start late. So myself and the BHAM team, Brain Health Advocacy Mission team, seek to improve health outcomes for all people in the greater Iron City area, across Alabama and beyond, through brain health intervention. You can help yourself and your community by joining BHAM today. How? First, I invite you to join us by taking action to lower your own risk for memory loss. Get cracking. Time is of the essence. The younger you start, the better it is, but it's never too late. Those of you in your 40s and 50s, get going. Health targets and set a goal, not so high and lofty that it's unachievable. Do something that's doable, and encourage others to do the same. For some, having a buddy or a group doing the dozen might be helpful. Try to begin to add other targets and goals during the year. You will start to feel yourself becoming more empowered in your own health, and you'll be helping your body's command center stay stronger. You in partnership with your primary care provider. Also, you may be eligible to participate in the BHAM clinical program at either the UAB Highlands or UAB Hoover Family Medicine clinics, or at the UAB Camellia Group, which we're going to be starting soon. Call my team's clinic at area code 205-934-2334 to learn more, or or ask your provider at one of the clinics just mentioned. Additionally, you can join us engaging in educating others. Request an educational BHAM presentation by a UAB BHAM speaker for your place of worship, club, or organization. We are available for you. Our program director, Jessica Brooks-Lane, can help you, and her information is on the slide, you can see. Finally, you can join by investing in BHAM to help us reach and serve more people in clinics and more communities. Contact UAB Advancement Officer Morgan Qualls. She can help you make a meaningful philanthropic gift. Maybe that's a gift that both honors someone special to you while bettering brain health for all of us. Morgan's information is also on the screen. You have my permission to share my secret and my discoveries. Everything I presented to you is evidence-based. It is doable and can happen now. So once you join me and the Brain Health Advocacy Mission so we can save more brains together, thank you very much, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We have questions coming in already. And if you do have a question and you're in the audience, go ahead and toss it in the chat. If you mark it as chat, it'll automatically go into the Q&A only. If it's not, we'll go ahead and filter it in there. So Dr. Lazar, I'm going to go ahead and start all the way from the beginning. So I'm going to scroll all the way down with the questions. And when you talked about exercise, is 5 hours of intense exercise
I'm sorry,
a week?
Greg. I'm having a little.
And I do see that
I'm having trouble hearing you, Greg. I'm really sorry.
No, that's fine. I see that you're kind of breaking up. I don't know if it's my end or your end, but that's okay. We'll get through this. So is 5 hours of intense exercise a week overdoing it?
You know what I'm going to...
And I think he's going to go ahead and dump out and come back in, try a different computer. He had one on standby. So if you do have questions, like I said, go ahead and toss them in the chat. I see Dr. Lazar there has kind of frozen there. Let me do this, Dr. Lazar. I'm going to go ahead and let's see. We're going to turn off the screen share. There we go. Let's try this. Is this better for you?
I think it is. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So when it comes to exercise, is 5 hours of intense exercise a week overdoing it for a 62-year-old?
That's a question you have to ask your doctor because he knows your physical profile. It depends on your blood pressure and other risk factors. Do you have arthritis and so forth? So all of the things I described that involve lifestyle changes, you need to consult your physician or licensed nurse practitioner, whoever is your primary care provider, to discuss it. So for some people, it might be fine and some people not. Just the guideline is that it should be 75 minutes per week of high intensity exercise or 150 minutes per week of moderate exercise.
And obviously, high intensity differs person to person as well.
That's correct. It's actually measured about how much oxygen utilization you have, and that gets technical.
So somebody has heard that, people say alcohol is good for you. Some alcohol is good for you. You mentioned that it's, 2 drinks per day for men, 3 a week, whatever it is. So what part of some alcohol is good? This person imagined no alcohol would be most optimal.
That is correct. No alcohol is the best. There's no doubt about that. So there's some data that suggests that red wine might be beneficial to you, but those data are controversial. But whatever evidence there is about red wine, white wine is not as good. So it's a matter of how much risk you're willing to engage in. The less alcohol, the better it is for the brain.
Does secondhand smoke have an impact on one's brain? Not sure if you heard that last question. So does secondhand smoke have an impact on the brain?
I'm still having problems hearing you, Greg. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's okay. I saw you, whatever happened, you dumped out and came back in. So that might be a good thing. Does secondhand smoke have an impact on one's brain?
Yes, it does. The data are clear about that as well, because you're inhaling this smoke, which is toxic to the respiratory system. Is it as bad as smoking yourself? No, but it is also affects people in your environment.
And I apologize for this next question because sometimes I see a word and I don't have a chance to practice it. So are plasma proteomics possible biomarkers for brain health risk?
I'm sorry. I'm not quite sure what you're saying. If I could look at the question, it might be helpful.
Yeah, if you hover over the chat and go down to Q&A, if you can click it there, that should be at the top. It's the last one. Are plasma proteomics possible biomarkers for brain health risk?
You can learn certain things. There are markers for the brain, but one of the things you need to understand is the blood that circulates in the body goes up to the vessels around the brain, but the things that are in those blood vessels don't necessarily get into the brain because of a barrier called the blood-brain barrier. So some of them can serve as biomarkers, certainly for things related to inflammatory markers. They provide risk, but it's not actually measuring what's taking place in the brain itself. So there are more data coming out about these plasma proteomics, and I think eventually over time there'll be more, but it is not definitive at this point in time.
Does the use of medication lessen the risk if you've been diagnosed with some of these risk factors that you've discussed?
That's a great question. So the REGARD study, which takes place at UAB, is a 30,000 individual population study, which looks at a lot of these risk factors. And they published a paper in 2015, which showed that the more medications you take to get to the same blood pressure level, the worse you do. And the reason why that's the case is because you probably have a history of having these risk factors much longer. And so it may prevent future changes, but it doesn't turn back the clock for changes that have already taken place already. So we do it so we don't get worse, but it doesn't necessarily reverse some of the effects in the brain.
Do people have to live locally to become a BHAM participant?
No, they don't. If you belong to either the Hoover or Highlands clinics, you're welcome to come and participate in that. If coming up you're a part of the Camellia group, you can do that too. But our goal is to expand this over time. It's a pilot project now with initial funding by the UAB McKnight Brain Institute, but we want to expand this to more clinics, both within the Birmingham area and throughout Alabama. And so that is why we made the appeal, at the end of the last slide, that if people want to see this expand, then philanthropically they may be of help.
Great questions still coming in. So how does family history play into risk of dementia or Alzheimer's?
That's a great question. So family health does confer additional risk, but it still doesn't mean it's not modifiable. If you have a history of hypertension, then that's something to pay attention earlier, and you start monitoring this from the very beginning. You don't wait till you're 50 or 60 years old. So if you take care of it early on and discovered in your 20s you have high blood pressure, you've mitigated the long-term risk of having it. So you can actually do things. And another point too is there's an emerging field called epigenetics. And epigenetics has found that environmental influences can alter gene expression. So just because you have a particular gene necessarily mean it manifests itself. And as we learn more about this epigenetic process, we'll learn more about external manipulations that can affect genes that we might have inherited.
Does it matter if the daily recommended 7 hours of sleep are one in increments rather than all at once?
That's another great question. There's recent data to suggest that if you have periods of sleep throughout the day, if we were able to do that, that actually may be better than one chunk of 7.5 hours. Now, the ability to do that or the opportunity is not great for most of us. So if you have broken sleep during the night, that's not a good thing. But if you have a reasonable amount of sleep at night, then that's probably the most reasonable, practical way of achieving your sleep goals.
What moderate exercise do you recommend for a mid-50-year-old female? And I think that goes back to talking to your own physician, correct?
So it is working on a treadmill. It is working on an elliptical device. It's anything that gets your heart rate going. It could be jogging. If it's up to you. Walking is not enough. So you can discuss this with your physician, and any one of those alternatives are useful. And you could go to UAB's recreational gym. You may have a club that you belong to nearby. And a number of insurance companies actually give you reductions in your premium if you engage in exercise. So there are lots of incentives to do it, and your brain loves it.
Do migraines add to the risk of dementia?
That's a great question, and on blood vessels, but I don't know directly the answer to the question.
Going back to the study, is there an age limit for the study?
No.
Perfect. Is it possible, let's see here, to share the presentation with a colleague? We're going to go ahead and everybody's going to be able to look at the presentation as often as they'd like because it's going to be on our website. So share with all your family and friends whatever you would like. So what about biphasic sleeping? Is that an effective as all at once? I think we already touched on that. That sleeping, obviously, we want to try to do consistently as possible. Is C-reactive protein elevated in Alzheimer's patients?
So C-reactive protein is an inflammatory marker. It's a measure of inflammation. And there are fairly good data to show that when you have this systemic inflammation, it does affect cognitive decline in the brain over time. There's been a number of studies that showed that. The Northern Manhattan Stroke Study showed that fairly well. So it is a risk factor because I said inflammation does get into the brain. So it's not a unique risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. It's one thing among many things which create risk. The notion is that anything that causes inflammation in the brain weakens the brain cells to do things. It creates vulnerability. So we want to reduce as much vulnerability as possible.
So when it comes to the study, person says that Hoover and Highlands, they're affluent areas. Are you trying to recruit a diverse population throughout the study? That's
a great question. So what we have done is we have started reaching out to Black churches. And we it's an aspect of what we're doing, which is just in its initial stages. But we recognize that there is often hesitancy coming to large institutions and getting healthcare in general. There's distrust of the healthcare community in some instances. And so we've reached out to the Black, African and Black community, and we have a definite initiative in that direction. We want to help everybody.
What age do you think a screening for dementia should occur?
So the most recent data suggests that screening for dementia actually has very little impact on outcomes now in the long term because there's no treatment for it. So if you're worried about it, you get screened, and if it turns out there's a problem, then they could try to look at early factors. Cognition is extremely sensitive to brain integrity, but it's not specific to any kind of pathology, whether it's stroke or tumors or infection, whatever. So there are lots of reasons why cognition can decline in an acute setting. And so if you feel your cognition is changing, you go to your doctor and they look for reversible causes. It could be a hormonal problem, it could be an endocrine problem. It could be in an older individual, you have a urinary tract infection. And so those are all potentially reversible. And so getting screened is not a bad idea for that case. But you shouldn't do it if you do not have any complaints for a cognitive problem. There's really no reason to get a screening. The definition of dementia, so everybody knows this, is not only objective measures of cognitive decline, there has to be an impact in your activities of daily living. If your activities of daily living are really unaffected in your own sense, even if there's some subjective sense, you don't necessarily have to get an evaluation. It's really when it gets to the point where something is interfering with how you live on a day-to-day basis.
Is exposure to artificial light at night, a risk factor for dementia?
It's an interesting question that I don't know the answer to.
Okay. Intermittent fasting. We had one of our most popular webinars focused on intermittent fasting. So is it healthy for the brain, for instance, a 24-hour fast?
I haven't seen a lot of data on that. Most of the emphasis is on what you eat as opposed to when you don't eat. And some people feel that fasting creates better clearance out of the brain and toxins get out of the brain. So there is some evidence that that might be beneficial, but in terms of actual brain health, I haven't seen the studies.
Would you touch on how someone would know the right amount of stress to have for work and ways you'd recommend to reduce that stress in the workplace?
Oh my goodness, you need mental health providers to really address a complicated, important question like that. So, stress is a very subjective response. So what stress does, it creates anxiety. And anxiety could have physical manifestations, it could have mental manifestations, and it differs from person to person. The same stressors for one person are tolerated in another individual and vice versa. So you really have to judge for yourself whether it's impacting your ability to think about things, your energy level, your interactions with people. And if you find that, stress could be a factor. And you tried, if that's the case, if it's at work, then you talk to if it's at home, you talk to the people who you interact with on a day-to-day basis. You should have conversations about this. Don't let it lie and say, well, it's my problem. No, it's a social problem and everyone needs to deal with it. And there's some stresses that are more difficult to deal with. Well, if you live in a community with a high crime rate and so stress is very high, well, that's more difficult to deal with. And I don't have an easy answer to that, but that is a cause of stress. And they're data to show that individuals who are actually actively discriminated against in a racist kind of situation, stress levels go up and inflammation goes up.
Drinking more water seems to be beneficial for everything. Are there any studies of adequate hydration related to brain health?
Treat hydration for your brain the way you do your heart. You're supposed to have a certain number of 8-ounce glasses of water a day. I think it's 8 glasses a day. That's what you do for the brain. In many ways, you treat the heart like the brain. But the reality that we have is that even people who are aware for the impact on the heart, it hasn't changed behavior. So the idea is if we now think of the brain, something that's so sacrosanct to us, being affected these things, perhaps it creates the impetus to actually do these things.
So we talked a little bit about drinking, we talked about smoking, but how bad is using smokeless tobacco, 1 can per week even, on the brain?
Smokeless tobacco. I just know about vaping, and which has a high nicotine content, higher than regular cigarettes and cigarettes, but I don't know the answer. Well, all these great questions. I wish I had experts along with me to be able to address these. I really don't know. The fact is, you need to stop smoking, pure and simple, every form of it that you can.
Can previous injuries like multiple concussions affect long-term brain health and memory?
Well, it turns out to be yes. Those data first came out in the late 1980s, and I wasn't sure I was convinced about it. But in fact, there's increasing data that multiple concussions, especially associated with losses of consciousness, lead to cognitive decline and dementia. And perhaps the most dramatic case of that is chronic traumatic encephalopathy among professional athletes. That comes from chronic concussions, and the repeated injuries are thought to be things that lead. It's not a single concussion. You know that athletes, let's say in football, get more brain subconcussions during practice than they during games because there's so much more practice time spent. And what is also true, that even in Pee Wee football, they're getting subconcussions as well. And the data just show from the
It looks as though Dr. Lazar just froze up on us. Hopefully we'll get him right back. These are fantastic questions. I'm going to go ahead and cap the questions right now. Dr. Lazar, I got you back. So I'm going to go and just cap the questions with what we have now, because I think that's probably what we have time for. Is there any hope for a 75-year-old? This person worked until they're 72. They worked as an RN. They feel like things otherwise are fine, but should they be concerned?
Your brain health can be intervened at any time. 75 is terrific. You exercise, of all the interventions that you can do, exercise affects all the other 11. It's fascinating that exercise has this huge domino effect. So doing exercise, social interaction are really terrific things at age 75 and will help keep your brain as it is now. So I would absolutely advocate for that. It's never too late.
What about Prevagen and other drugs for dementia? Do they all help even for a short term?
I'm really glad you asked that question because it gives me a chance to make a comment. So I read the paper that was published about the effectiveness of Prevagen. It appeared in a journal that was published by the company that manufactured the drug. So that was one thing that bothered me a little bit. So I read the paper. So when you conduct a clinical trial, what you do is you give some people the drug and some people you give, let's say, a sugar tablet. And you see in a blinded study where the benefit lies. And before you do the study, you have to state what your primary important outcome is. And that is your definitive conclusion. Well, when you read the Prevagen paper, it did not make its primary outcome. It didn't, and even acknowledges that. So it went back after the fact, dug through the paper, dug through their data, and they found one small set that had impact in one specific skill. Now, if those data were presented to the FDA, they would be rejected. Because if you look at enough data long enough, you're going to find something. And so by any scientific standard, there's no evidence that supports it. And I see it in drugstores all the time. I hear the testimonies all the time. We have to think about the expectancy effect, the halo effect. You take something, you think it works, and in fact, you feel better from it. And there's studies to show even in controlled trials that people get better with the placebo because of this expectancy effect. But physiologically, there's no evidence that supports it. One more point about this. If you take ginkgo, which years ago was widely used for memory loss. And so the government finally funded a study called the GEM study. And they compared ginkgo to placebo and to see what would benefit memory. It turns out that the study had to be stopped early. Why was that? It was because it turned out that individuals who were taking a blood thinner and taking ginkgo, they were competing at the same place for metabolism. There was too much thinning of the blood, and these people are actually getting internal hemorrhages from ginkgo, no less. And so anything you put into your body is a biological substance, it's a drug. And there are interactions with other things that you're taking. So is there evidence that some of these work? Well, there's some historical evidence and cultural evidence that it may have some benefit. But in fact, there are drug-drug interactions, and you just merely don't go into a store and pick up a supplement and think it's going to work. You've got to talk to your primary care provider about it.
Just a few more questions, and then we'll wrap things up. So if somebody has systemic inflammation, but markers are repeatedly negative, does the negative result mean that the brain is not inflamed? And why would the markers be negative in a patient that has multiple...
I'm sorry, Greg, you're breaking up again.
Okay, hopefully this is better. If one has systemic inflammation, but markers are repeatedly negative, does the negative result mean that the brain is not inflamed? And why would the markers be negative in a patient that has multiple systemic symptoms of inflammation?
Well, that's a good question. Not all inflammation gets into the brain. So what typically has to happen is that some of the inflammatory proteins actually weaken the blood-brain barrier, which is the protective thing around the brain, and then other inflammatory proteins get in. So it could be that those particular inflammatory proteins are not ones that break down the blood-brain barrier, that molecules can be too large and they just simply can't break through. So not all inflammation is the same. There are certain inflammatory markers which are known to be bad for the brain. And they're interleukin-1, inter-1b, interleukin-6, and so forth. So, but not all inflammation gets into the brain.
How does phone, video games, social media, technology, all of that use, how does that impact the brain?
That's actually a pretty broad question. So if it isolates you and you're not having social interactions with people, that's not a good thing. Social media also can cause stress. We see that a lot in younger people. That's not a good thing either. Can it benefit people who are isolated, who would otherwise not have contact with people? Yes, that's a good thing. So there's not a simple answer to it. What I tell some patients, for example, in rural Alabama, whose grandchildren are 2 hours away by car, is to get on Skype and Zoom and talk to your kids and have discussions with them and laugh with them. That's a good thing. But just think of all of the risk factors. Moderation is the key.
Final question, and then we'll wrap things up. So can eating disorders impact brain health?
I'm sorry, could you say the question again?
Sure can. Can eating disorders impact brain health?
You're breaking up. Are you asking if eating disorders affect the brain?
Correct.
Yeah, the answer is yes, because you're not getting the nutrients that the brain needs. And in some extreme cases, if you have a vitamin B1 deficiency at the extreme level, you can have severe memory problems. So it's all part of having your balanced diet of all the different food groups in moderate amounts. But if someone has, and if they're dehydrated as well, that makes it even worse. So an eating disorder.
And once again, Dr. Lazar, thank you so much for spending the better part of an hour with us tonight, going over brain health and the dozen things that we can do to kind of help us in the future. So thank you again so much for joining us, taking time out of your night. Just a reminder for our audience, tonight's webinar was recorded. A replay will be made available tomorrow. And be sure to come back and join us for other upcoming webinars. On Wednesday, July 27th, we'll host Dr. Suzanne Judd for Biology of Your Diet. This session is the second in a 4-part series on nutrition, your diet, and you. Then join us for the third part of the series on Thursday, August 25th. That's when Dr. Lizzie Davis will be with us for To Infant and Beyond, looking at nutrition through the life cycle. On Tuesday, August 30th, we will welcome Nancy Ball for Estate Planning, Understanding the Basics, where we'll get a basic overview of all core estate planning documents, as well as some strategies to consider. And on Wednesday, September 14th, Dr. Judd will be back for the final part of our nutrition series. That day, we'll present brain food, as we'll explore more than 30 foods that have brain function benefits. You can register for all of these webinars and check out other upcoming offerings at alumni.uab.edu/events. Wind the summer down with us on Sunday, August 14th. We'll be on the campus green for the first ever Legacy Family Day, sponsored by Legacy Credit Union. Get a picture taken with Blaze, enjoy Italian ice and gelato, take a trip down our water slides, and even we'll have a petting zoo. It's only $5 to register. Visit alumni.uab.edu/family day. Looking for something to listen to during your commute to the office, or even while you're at the office, check out the UAB Green and Told podcast. New episodes debut every other week with conversations from members of the UAB community. The podcast can be downloaded on Spotify, the Apple Podcast app, or on our website. And be sure to stay on top of all things alumni. Take a look at our social media. We can be found by searching UAB Alumni on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. On LinkedIn, search Alumni Career Community. Finally, we'd love to know how we did. The QR code on your screen directs you to a short survey. Let us know your thoughts by providing feedback on tonight's webinar. Once again, thank you for joining Dr. Lazar and me for tonight's webinar. And as always, Go Blazers!